To begin, I would like to acknowledge that regardless of where we are Zooming from, we are on the land of the first people. The land I am living on right now is that of the Coast Salish, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Puyallup nations. Here in Seattle in general, we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe past and present. For the benefit of the public who have joined us today, I will introduce my colleagues and myself. I am the chair of the Washington Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. My name is Alexis Harris. For identification purposes only, I am a professor of sociology at the University of Washington. Members of the committee who are present today are Tony Benengus, David DeWolf, Judy Endigen, Andrew Kaufman, Zan Nider, Conrad Reynoldson, Eric Schnapper, and Brian Screener. Our other members who may be attending at a later point in today's meeting are Kimberly Ambrose, Luzvaminda Carpenter, Gary Laughlin, John Sarfarley, and Aaron With. We do have a quorum present and will proceed with the meeting. Also present are commission staff, Brooke Peary, civil rights analyst, Angelica Trevino, support specialist, and Kelly McGrath, a civil rights intern. And we want to thank you three so much for all of your support in making these hearings happen. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is an independent, bipartisan agency of the federal government charged with studying discrimination or denial of equal protection of the laws because of race, color, religion, sex, age, disability, or national origin, or in the administration of justice. In each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, an advisory committee to the commission has been established, and they are made up of responsible persons who serve without compensation to advise the commission on relevant information concerning their respective states. Today, our purpose is to hear testimony regarding the involvement of Washington communities in the process of police accountability. Today's meeting will also include a period for public comment. Later on in the agenda, there will be an opportunity for members of the public to share their perspectives and opinions. If you are a member of the public who joined online, commission staff will be messaging you to see if you would like to comment. Please keep an eye on the chat box for that message. For the members of the public who are joined on the phone with audio only, you will be able to indicate with your keypad when we reach the point in the agenda if you would like to make a comment and indicate as so. At the outset, I want to remind everyone present of our ground rules. This is a public meeting, open to the media and the general public. I want to remind everyone that this meeting will be transcribed from a recording for public record. I ask that you please state your name when speaking. Panelists should limit their initial remarks to 10 minutes. After all the panelists have spoken, advisory committee members will have the opportunity to ask you questions, and we'll do that in a roll call manner. In addition, written statements may be submitted to Brooke Peary at bpeery@usccr.gov by June 18th, 2021. Though some of the statements made today might be controversial, we want to ensure that all invited guests feel welcomed and do not defame or degrade any person or any organization. As the acting chair of today's meeting, I reserve the privilege to cut short any statements that defame, degrade, or do not pertain to the issue at hand. Any person or any organization that feels defamed or degraded by statements made in these proceedings should contact our staff during the meeting so that we can provide a chance for public response. Alternately, such persons or organizations can file written statements for inclusion in the proceedings. I urge all persons making presentations to be judicious in their statements. The advisory committee appreciates the willingness of all of the participants to share their views and experiences with this committee. We really appreciate you joining us today and spending your afternoon with us. I would now like to begin our meeting by introducing the panelists. You will each have 10 minutes, and I will call on you each time it's your turn, but we will go in order of the agenda. With about the last minute of your 10 minutes, I will let you know that you have a minute remaining. So please try to conclude your remarks at that point. So today we are joined by Mr. Tim Reynon from the Puyallup Tribal Member and the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. We also have Ms. Allison Holcomb from the ACLU of Washington. Hopefully we will be having Ms. Carmen Best, the retired Seattle police chief. She indicated that she has a family issue that came up unexpectedly, so we hope that she will be able to join us. Mr. James Bible from the James Bible Law Group as well. We're hoping he'll be able to hop on the call. And then Mr. Marlon Brown with Black Lives Matter Seattle will also be joining on a little later in the meeting. So Mr. Raynon, we will begin with you. If you'd like to please start your 10-minute presentation.
Ashlachel Togalapu, Siya Biished, Tim Raynon Teedsda, Spoyala Papsched. Good day to you, honorable and noble people. My name is Tim Raynon. I'm a member of the Puyallup Tribe and the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. I serve as the chair of the Law and Justice Committee for the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians and as a commissioner with the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. Before starting my comments, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the ancestral homelands of my people, the Poyalapapsh people. Our people have lived on this land since the beginning of time, and we are still here today. We know all too well the reality of systemic racism and the effects of police use of force on Native communities. From being forcibly removed from their families and tribal communities, often at the hands of police, taken to boarding schools where they were abused, ridiculed, and punished for exercising their culture and speaking their language, all in the name of kill the Indian, save the man, to having local, state, and federal law enforcement officers stand atop a bridge spanning our Puyallup River, aiming their rifles and shotguns at our people while other officers raided and desecrated our ceremonial grounds and fishing camp and beat our men, women, and children and hauled them off to jail simply for exercising our treaty-protected right to fish. Our people know all too well the devastating impacts of historical trauma at the hands of government and law enforcement, which our tribal communities continue to struggle with even today. To Native people, systemic racism and the fear of police use of deadly force is real, and we live with it every day of our lives. We experienced the devastating impact of police use of force yet again 5 years ago, when one of our young tribal members, Jacqueline Sawyers, was shot and killed by a Tacoma police officer as she began to drive away from the scene where officers were attempting to arrest her boyfriend. Jackie's family and the families of John T. Williams, Daniel Covarrubias, Renee Davis, Stonechild Chiefstick, and the hundreds of other Native families who've lost a loved one at the hands of police are reminded every day about the devastating impacts police use of deadly force has on their families and our tribal communities. According to the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, the racial group most likely to be killed by law enforcement is Native Americans. And according to Fatal Encounters, an online database that tracks deadly encounters with police, approximately 131 Native Americans have died during an interaction with police since the beginning of 2016, the last 5+ years. The government-sanctioned killing of Native people must stop, and it must stop now. It is long past time that we start to face and grapple with the role policing has played in keeping our Native people down and do everything we can to change it. This is why I am here today, and this is why I join with impacted families and communities across our state in the work of police reform and accountability. One way to decrease police use of excessive force and hopefully bring these killings to an end is to change police culture and police behavior through increased community engagement, increased transparency, and increased accountability. Increasing community engagement will decrease excessive force by humanizing the people law enforcement officers engage with, by providing increased opportunities for police officers to work with, get to know the communities they serve. They will begin to understand their culture, their perspectives, and the challenges they face, which will hopefully lead to greater empathy and understanding for those they serve. It will begin to break stereotypes that officers may have about the people in their communities, particularly Black and Brown people, which we hope will change the way officers approach situations involving these folks. And as more community members are engaged in policing oversight and reform, transparency and accountability will increase. As transparency and accountability increases, and officers who unjustifiably use excessive force are held accountable and removed from the force, police behavior and culture will change, and that will reduce the use of excessive force and will save lives. And so it is imperative that policymakers at all levels, federal, state, local, and law enforcement, involve impacted families and community stakeholders, including tribes, in the policymaking process. We've found that there is no substitute for lived experiences to help inform and shape effective, responsive policy. Getting communities involved in police training, oversight, and accountability to change police culture and police behavior was one of the main reasons for I-940 and the legislation we worked on during this year's legislative session. I-940 brought more community involvement in the development of training curriculum and independent investigations of police use of force. Senate Bill 5051 rebalanced the power dynamic of the Criminal Justice Training Commission by requiring a majority of commissioners to be non-law enforcement community members, and it provided greater community involvement in the oversight and development of training curriculum and policies at the state's law enforcement training academy, as well as the officer decertification process. House Bill 1267 created a completely independent investigative agency with a community-led advisory board, which will employ non-law enforcement professional investigators to conduct investigations of all police use of deadly force cases in the state of Washington. These are just a few examples of ways we engaged impacted families and communities to develop policies that will reduce police use of excessive force and save lives. We believe the changes we've worked on this year can serve as a model for the rest of the country on how to engage impacted families and communities to change police culture and police behavior. I want to touch briefly on the role community stakeholders should play in police agency investigatory and disciplinary processes involving the use of force. As my earlier remarks indicated, I believe impacted families and communities should be involved in the oversight and regulation of police, including the investigatory and disciplinary processes involving the use of force. As is provided for in Senate Bill 5051, community-led regulatory agencies like the Washington CJTC should have the authority to suspend, place on probation, or require remedial training, in addition to granting, denying, or revoking certification of a peace officer or corrections officer's license. Provide for the comprehensive and timely investigation of complaints against peace officers and corrections officers. Require law enforcement and corrections agencies to administer a thorough background investigation to ensure an individual is fit to be an officer and capable of treating those they are sworn to serve and protect with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin, socioeconomic status, or cultural background. And review a law enforcement agency's command decisions, policies, and training practices, investigations, or disciplinary decisions regarding misconduct, potential systemic violations of law or policy, unconstitutional policing, or other matters, and issue public recommendations to the agency's governing body regarding how to address those shortcomings. As was hoped for in I-940, communities should also be included in the actual investigations of police use of force cases. Knowledgeable, trusted community members could bring much needed transparency and credibility to such investigations. Involving impacted families and communities in the disciplinary and investigative processes involving police use of force will bring greater transparency and accountability to law enforcement, which in turn will help restore communities' trust of law enforcement. For our Native families and communities, the fact that these new laws provide us with an opportunity to finally sit at the table to share our experiences and provide our perspectives is long past due. As one of the groups that have been and continue to be most impacted by police use of deadly force, we are standing up and saying enough is enough. We are ready to lead the way in dismantling the inherently racist justice system that has oppressed our people from the day the colonists and settlers arrived on our lands, and replace it with a more equitable, fair, and restorative justice system. that respects and protects the sanctity of all life. Justice for Jackie, for John T., for Daniel, for Renee, for Stonechild, and the many others is justice for all. I raise my hands to each and every one of you for holding this hearing today. Thank you, honorable and noble people, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I am finished.
Thank you so much, Mr. Raynon, for sharing your perspectives, your insight, and the powerful recommendations that you have for needed changes. You remind us of why we're doing this work, that communities are hurting and have been hurting, and that there's changes that we need to make. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ms. Allison Holcomb from the ACLU of Washington.
Thank you so much, committee members, for inviting me to speak with you today. Excessive use of force by a law enforcement officer against a community member constitutes a violation of that community member's civil liberties as guaranteed by the Bill of Rights attached to the U.S. Constitution and ratified on December 15, 1791. The Fourth Amendment within the Bill of Rights protects community members from unreasonable seizures by government actors like the police. 170 years later, the United States Supreme Court first held that this protection is enforceable against state and local governments, not just the federal government, through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment in the case of Mapp v. Ohio, which involved an illegal search and use of force by 3 white male Cleveland police officers against a Black woman who dared to stand up for her rights, Miss Dalry Mapp. Almost 30 years later, in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court held that claims of law enforcement use of excessive force are to be analyzed under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness test in the case of Graham v. Connor. DeThorne Graham was a Black man suffering the onset of a diabetic insulin reaction when he hurried in and out of a convenience store where the line was too long for him to purchase his orange juice quickly. He drew the attention of a Charlotte, North Carolina police officer who tailed him and the friend who had driven him to the store. And Mr. Graham ultimately suffered a broken foot, cuts on his wrists, a bruised forehead, an injured shoulder during the course of an investigatory stop conducted by multiple officers who responded to Officer Connor's request for backup. When Officer Connor finally received word that Mr. Graham had done nothing wrong at the convenience store, the officers drove him home, still in handcuffs, pulled him out of a police car, laid him out on his front yard, took the handcuffs off, and simply drove away. It is important that Ms. Mapp's and Mr. Graham's cases eventually made their way to the U.S. Supreme Court and provided confirmation that cities and counties are obliged under the U.S. Constitution to provide policing services free of excessive use of force against community members. However, leaving individual community members to seek redress in the courts after their rights have been violated can never fully repair the physical, mental, and emotional damage done to an individual on the receiving end of excessive use of police force, to the family members who've lost loved ones to such unnecessary violence, or to the people who observe disproportionate rates of excessive use of force specifically against their communities, as well as against those who would demonstrate in the streets to draw attention to these disproportionate rates of police violence against Black and African Americans, Native Americans, Latin Americans, Asian and Pacific Islander Americans, American Muslims, Sikhs, and Arabs, and other people of color, as well as against people with disabilities who are too frequently, too quickly, and wrongly assumed to be dangerous. The damage caused to community members on the receiving end of excessive use of force reverberates across our entire society. Police are the face we have given to justice. They are the face we have given to safety. After decades of calling state, local, and national attention to the problem of police excessive use of force and observing that it has not stopped, it is entirely reasonable for community members to question whether our society is truly just and whether it cares about the safety of all or only the privileged. From the perspective of these community members, cities and counties are honoring the right for them to be protected against excessive use of police force more in the breach than in the observance. We can correct course, reduce, and even eliminate excessive use of force with the help of community members playing a central role in transforming our approach. As the recipients of policing services, community members are cities and counties' most valuable partners in creating new, transparent, and more effective systems and processes for preventing, identifying, and addressing problematic use of force as soon as it surfaces and before it escalates. However, we cannot get there until we address the fact that local governments have acceded to demands police unions, guilds, and professional associations have made at the contract bargaining table to protect their members from accountability for serious police misconduct, thereby obstructing delivery of constitutional policing and increasing the likelihood that community members' civil liberties and civil rights will be violated. What is needed is clarification of the distinction between true labor issues, such as wages, benefits, and other matters related to the relationship between workers and management, from issues uniquely related to policing powers and state-sanctioned use of force, interactions between police and community members, and accountability for misconduct committed against members of the public. The latter basket of issues directly implicate state and local obligations to protect community members' constitutional rights and have no place at the bargaining table. State and local laws that allow negotiation of these matters have an established record of erecting structural barriers to accountability and reinforcement of these barriers through deference to the precedents of private arbitration of police disciplinary appeals. Departmental investigation of community members' complaints is delayed, derailed, and reversed. Problematic behavior is pushed downstream until it erupts with tragic and avoidable consequences. In the 2021 Washington State Legislative Session, the ACLU of Washington worked with experts in police accountability and labor law to draft legislation designed to address these issues and bring community expertise to bear in helping state and local governments create new systems and processes for decreasing excessive use of force and other forms of serious police misconduct. Senate Bill 5134, introduced by Washington State Senator Jesse Solomon, will require local jurisdictions to establish systems for receiving and investigating misconduct complaints and imposing discipline when appropriate, including reasonable opportunities for the public to review and comment on the laws, rules, or departmental policies proposed to establish these systems. In creating those opportunities for community members to provide input, jurisdictions will be required to take into consideration challenges to access, such as availability of public transportation, differences in access to technology and the internet, disability, and language barriers. The adopted laws, rules, or departmental policies will be required to be posted by each jurisdiction on a publicly facing website to promote transparency to and engagement with community members. Senate Bill 5134 enumerates a number of issues that should be prohibited topics for police contract bargaining if we are to remove and prevent obstructions to local governments providing policing that complies with the U.S. Constitution and protects community members from excessive use of force by law enforcement officers, a fundamental right that simply is not an appropriate matter for contract negotiation. Chief among them are waiting periods before agency leadership can interview officers regarding use of force incidents and limits on chiefs and sheriff's authority to remove officers from duty or place them on leave. Effective implementation of Senate Bill 5134 assumes active engagement of directly impacted community members, and in addition to the removal of structural barriers to formal accountability mechanisms, enhanced informal accountability facilitated through increased transparency and inclusion of community members in the development, review, and revisions of these systems and processes. Thank you again for the invitation and opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you for that. This issue actually came up Monday, talking one of the issues that you spoke to Monday around what should be negotiable in these contracts. So I'm sure in the question and answer, we will engage with you on that topic. So currently, I think we're going to move to Mr. Marlon Brown with Black Lives Matter Seattle. Thank you so much for spending a couple hours with us, Mr. Brown. You have 10 minutes to do the initial presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here and inviting me to this session. I have a PowerPoint to share, so I'll just get right into that. Yeah, I slept roughly in preparation for today, but I definitely wanted to dive into the questions that was posed to us as panelists. And so let me make sure that I am moving. And I really just kind of want to just jump into it because my siblings, Holcomb and Raynon, really laid out a lot of the responses that I align with. And so I'm just going to jump into the question, particularly how can community engagement or increased transparency help decrease excessive use of force? I really want to kind of dive into parts of this question, particularly around how our law enforcement agencies define community. Because, you know, if you think about and reflect on the history of policing in our country, the policing is working as design. You know, it has to already, you know, outline who community is based on its founding. And when we think about, you know, how that you know shows up in our society today, we got to dive into history and really understand what community, what is the definition of community that our law enforcement agencies are using. And then there's the matter of excessive use of force. This particularly is troubling because we know that excessive use of force is not equally distributed across the community. And so we find excessive use of force with Black and Brown residents, but we need to understand why. And I want to take us a bit deeper and into the history of policing in the U.S. I'm sure many of you know it. You know, the history of policing in the U.S. started, you know, as early as the 1700s, particularly to police slave. You know, they were called slave patrols to chase down runaway slaves and prevent slave revolts, primarily, you know, to protect those slave owners. And then through our history, we understand that many local sheriffs, you know, kind of recreated that function, really working to enforce segregation and disenfranchise people who were enslaved in this country. So the focus has always been on black folks, you know, and what's happening with Black bodies in this country. We go on to really understand that, you know, specifically in the Carolinas, it was the white slave owners who started these practices of policing, these slave patrols. It was always about their money and their property. And even through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, these slave patrols, now, you know, law enforcement agencies, work to reinforce the Black codes and keeping Black people in their place as language that has been historically used for reasons why we have been treated the way we have. So, there's no guesswork into why we see manifesting today this same language, the same behaviors when it comes to Black and Brown people. So, my response is that agencies need to define community and who they're serving. I took some time to really dive into a lot of agencies' websites to really understand their missions, as well as who are they talking about when they're talking about community. And it looks pretty on websites, but what we see in practice is something totally different. And it's in that difference that really needs to be interrogated. Agencies need to understand excessive use of force not being equally distributed across the community, who they're deeming community. I would venture to guess that if we were to see law enforcement agencies and officers putting their knees on the necks of white men and white women across this country, January 6th would have been just the tip of the iceberg. We would have seen uprisings like we've never really seen. They write storybooks about that, and so this double standard that we see in play is really egregious and very dismissive when it comes to the abuse and atrocities to our community, particularly BIPOC community. So when I think about, this question about community involvement in policing, we have to really take this opportunity to understand that our system of law enforcement does not trust communities of color and lack relationship with communities of color. And I would venture to guess that if, in fact, people had relationships, if our law enforcement agencies, if our prosecuting attorneys, if our judges had relationships with communities of color and really saw humanity in our communities and our people, in me, when I walk into the police office, when I walk into the courtroom, if these individuals and these systems saw me as fully human, the response to my body would not be the same, would not be what we've seen demonstrated time and time again in this country. So trust is a huge thing, but trust goes both ways, and there's a lot of work that needs to happen when it comes to trust us, Black and Brown people, trusting law enforcement agencies. There are some fundamental revisions needed to the system of policing and law enforcement. Clear definitions of service, clear expectations, and clear consequences for when expectations are not adhered to. And let's start with really expanding humanity to the whole community. I want to take this time to really reference what we see in play here in our political sphere. A lot of leaders are really leaning to this when it comes to law enforcement, that they're not racist. This country is not racist. As one politician recently stated, who so happens to look just like me, which is a scare in itself. And Dr. Kendi shared recently how the term "not racist" actually, it doesn't even exist, and that when we use that term, when people use that term, how dismissive it is of the lived experiences that we're having, not just Black and Brown people, but white people too. There's the context that has been developed, and racism and the implementation of racism has defined those experiences. There is a real systemic reason why white people have the lived experiences that they have, that they experience the comforts that they have, that they are able to inevitably get through school and find resources to gain degrees and eventually rise to the top and be celebrated as leaders. There's a system that's been designed to do that. that very same system has been designed to erect artificial barriers, as my sibling Holcomb shared, artificial barriers to our having those same experiences and outcomes in life. And we cannot ignore that. So saying that I'm not racist, I'm the most not racist person you ever met, and this country is not racist, are really fallacies. So when we think about racial bias and how this comes in the context of policing, there's two forms of that. There's explicit racial bias. There's implicit racial bias, and they're always working. And often we don't spend a lot of time talking about that context when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to relationships in general, even. Explicit racial bias, conscious prejudice in favor of or against one racial group compared with another, often understood to be unfair or harmful. Implicit bias, unconscious negative or positive associations based on racial identity, often coexisting with conscious rejection of prejudice and stereotypes, support for anti-discrimination efforts, etc. We make conscious and unconscious decisions based on the ways and the stories and narratives we've been socialized about each other. We are making decisions in our leadership opportunities based on those associations, those categorizations of people that we have learned throughout our lives, as young as our childhood, that are still reflected in our adult lives today. Thinking about implicit bias and really how our
Mr. Brown, you have 1 more minute.
Oh, geez, wow, time flies when you're having fun. Okay, let me fast forward. If our law enforcement agencies really saw us fully human, we wouldn't see these outcomes today. These folks would not have been treated and killed the way in which they have been in our society. And really taking into consideration our focus moving away from intent into impact, and really understanding the harm that has happened to us and acknowledging that. There's a significant amount of repair that needs to happen that our law enforcement agencies need to take into consideration and do something with that. There's some frame of references of how to do that repair that is really quickly tossed up here. And when it comes to the role of community, when it comes to police unions and investigatory processes, communities of color need to have a seat at the table, because if we're working on reestablishing trust, or establishing trust, actually, never was trust, establishing trust, we, as a way to earn that trust, we need to be at the table. We need to be involved. And that's it. I'll wrap it on up. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives and experiences. We are going to move into the discussion with the committee members now. And I will address each committee member in roll call style so that each member will have the opportunity to ask one question and then a follow-up question. Please wait for your name to be called before asking the question. I'll call you in order that I see your screens. If time allows, additional questions may be permitted. In the event that there's time for additional questions, please use the raise your hand function to indicate that you would like to speak, and I'll call on you to address the panelists. So we can begin with Andrew. Do you have questions for our panelists?
I do not have a question right now.
Okay, thank you. David, do you have questions?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and I would ask this of all the panelists if I could. Of the reforms that you would recommend, which are likely to make it easier to recruit new police officers, and which are likely to make it more difficult to recruit new police officers? So even the fact that it makes it more difficult doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. But if you could identify reforms that you think would actually either be neutral or would actually make it easier to recruit new police officers for our communities.
Mr. Raynon, do you want to start?
Well, boy, that's a loaded question. Quite honestly, what we're trying to do is get people in law enforcement who have the respect and the desire to serve all communities. And so, you know, of the reforms that we've worked on, I would hope that the ones that engage the community more, the ones that involve community in oversight, in investigations, I would hope those would invite more officers to join, because at the end of the day, we recognize that our officers are part of the community. They are part of the community, and they should have every desire and not fear having community members involved. So, I mean, my hope is that all of these reforms will invite and encourage law enforcement officers to apply for jobs, because we're changing the culture of policing, and it's a culture that they want to be a part of. The culture of policing has, for far too long, been abusive to many of us. And the fact that we are now moving it in a direction that is more inclusive, that is, you know, more equitable, I would hope that more people would want to be a part of that. That's what I have to say about that.
Thank you for that. Ms. Holcomb, do you have a response?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Mr. Brannon, and I will suggest that the reform that I spoke most about, which is to take matters relating to, for example, excessive use of force and other serious police misconduct that implicate constitutional rights of community members, to take those matters out of the collective bargaining framework, to pass a state law that makes it clear that these are not appropriate matters for collective bargaining, accomplishes two goals that relate to the question of hiring, recruiting more police officers, and I would say retaining police officers that promote the reform of the culture within a particular department. Those two aspects to this question are, first, that the barriers to meaningful accountability and fair, efficient, effective discipline that can get at problematic culture within a police department at the early stages, taking those structural obstacles away, not allowing those issues to be bargained, and removing this precedential cementing of those structural barriers through private arbitration of disciplinary matters for specifically police misconduct. That's one piece of it, right? We need to make it possible for meaningful accountability to occur through transparent systems and processes that have been developed in consultation with community. The other prong here is that I believe, I'm optimistic about the reorientation of the leadership of many departments across the state, or excuse me, across the country. I believe that there is an increasing number of police chiefs and sheriffs that recognize the problems that lack of meaningful accountability, the difficulty that they face in actually imposing accountability within their departments. It's not only harmful to the communities, it's harmful to their department. It makes it difficult to keep those officers we want to keep in that department, because those officers probably don't want to be in that culture as well. So by transforming the way that police accountability can be delivered, and from removing those obstacles that are created by contract negotiations, we're supporting an expansion of a new class, a new wave of police chiefs and sheriffs that are dedicated to community-centric, community accountable policing. And that's another important contributing factor to transforming the culture within each department. So we do feel very strongly that addressing the inappropriate bargaining of serious police misconduct accountability issues through police contracts, that is a most critical reform to changing the culture within our departments to make it more possible to recruit, hire, and retain better and happier police officers who have better relationships with the communities they serve.
Thank you for that. Mr. Brown, do you have a response to that question?
Yeah, I would. I agree completely with what's already been shared, and I think even when we, because of those barriers, especially with the contracts, are highly problematic. And when it comes to recruiting, being very intentional about what's being asked of these new recruits, really talking about these new recruits already having had education around culturally responsive policing and engagement in relationships, being very understanding the history and the context of this country and what we're asking them to do, and that is to police in a way that the community is asking, and that is, to be respectful, to preserve life. These things are pretty fundamental that just isn't broadly done. But we can recruit and address a lot of these matters on the front end. I think that is highly, because there's this unspoken, elephant in the room process where there are people who are getting into law enforcement for the sport of causing harm. There is fundamental, and there's even probably some data to show for that I don't have, but we need to shift that. Policing is not about what it has been, and we need to be recruiting people who want to actually protect and serve all of the community, and that needs to be in the forefront.
Thank you. Mr. DeWolf, do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Professor Schnapper, do you have a question for our panelists?
Yes. Thank you very much. And my question is particularly for Mr. Raynon and Mr. Brown. When Ms. Holcomb was talking, she expressed concern that there were provisions in collective bargaining agreements that made it more difficult for police departments to prevent or impose discipline for the excessive use of force. Do you think that collective bargaining agreements are creating those kinds of obstacles?
If I may, if I can go first,
Please.
Absolutely. We learned a lot about that in recent years, that those collective bargaining agreements have those built-in measures that prevent chiefs to make actions. And so, yes, absolutely. And that needs to change. People who have our lives in their hands because they get to carry a gun should be held to a higher standard when it comes to when those rights and privileges are abused and when life is lost. And to, the fact that it is explicitly written into contract language is a problem, and that needs to be addressed. Absolutely.
And I don't have a whole lot of experience with police unions other than working with people from, representatives of the unions and in some of the legislation we've worked on. But what I would say is that, yes, we need to address that. We've seen too many instances where an officer has followed police protocol and was able to get away with murder. And it's because of the, what's in the collective bargaining agreements. And so what Allison, Ms. Holcomb had mentioned about needing to remove those things that impact an individual's constitutional rights from collective bargaining is spot on. And so yes, we definitely need to work on that.
Thank you for that. Professor Schnapper, do you have a follow-up?
No, I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Benengus, do you have a question?
Sure. First of all, thank you, panelists. I am amazed at the knowledge you bring, and I'm in awe of eye-opening what my horizons are being broadened by your perspectives. Without the collective bargaining, that sounds like pretty much everyone agrees that's an issue that we really need to fix. But if you were king or queen for Washington, what specific things would you do, couple, to bring transparency and justice fairly for the people? What would you do specifically? And this is really for all the panelists. Thank you.
Who wants to jump in first?
You want to jump in, Allison, first?
That's really not fair, Tim. I will take this opportunity to echo what my colleagues had said about the importance of us thinking together about how we actually create more muscle memory around consultation between police officers and community members. We were asked today to talk about how transparency to and engagement with community members can help decrease excessive use of force by law enforcement officers. And I think both of my colleagues beautifully articulated the reality that violence happens much more rarely when you see the person on the other side of your conversation as a real human being. And I don't know exactly what those structures look like. I am heartened by the City of Seattle's efforts to pass in 2017 a very robust accountability ordinance that included the creation of a community policing commission that really had as its mission to create that forum for there to be opportunities for community members to weigh in on policies and to share their personal reflections of their lived experience in their interactions with police officers. Not just the bad, not just what we criticize, not just what we want to change and reform, but the good as well, to reinforce the positive experiences and to do that culture shifting work. So I think we have to formalize that and turn that into muscles that we're required to grow. We need to create systems and structures that make our feet go first and let our hearts and minds follow. And then, of course, we need to reform police contracting. But really and truly, if I were a king or queen and could change the way that community members engage with police, it would be creating those formal structures to require that type of relationship building and face-to-face engagement.
Thank you. Do other panelists want to respond? Mr. Brown?
Yeah. Yeah, I've dreamt of this actually. Yeah, I have an interesting experience with law enforcement. Coming from Detroit, where majority of the police force looked like me when I was growing up, and having 6 police officers in my family, as well as being I was a police explorer. They had police cadets, police explorers for youth to be, exposed, have some exposure to law enforcement. And we literally went through the training, the police training. And never in my experience in Michigan did I ever fear a police officer. And I find that is very unique. I did not fear law enforcement until I moved to the state of Washington. And when I go back home, my interactions with the police, I still don't feel fear because many of them look like me. Many of them see me as a human. Many of them talk to me as a human. And it's not even racial. I speak to white police officers in Michigan who talk to me like I got some sense, leaning to my grandmother's language, and I don't feel that sense of fear. But when I engage with law enforcement officers here in the state of Washington, I am on a complete edge. And so if I had that opportunity to be king or queen of Washington, I would want that. I would want our police law enforcement um, agency to make residents feel like they're a sibling, like they're family, and that, their job in enforcing the laws don't shift based on the skin color of the person that they're with. And I've seen it. I know professionals who have trained law enforcement officers to not have the responses that we see that are filmed today. And I know that it's possible. I believe that.
Thank you. Mr. Raynon?
Yeah, I just want to echo what my colleagues here have shared. Reflecting on our tribal police department, we're a small community that has our own tribal police department, and our officers are from our community. Our best officers are the ones who are able to, say, I'm going to tell your auntie if you don't stop acting that way. They're the ones that know our community the best. And so, if I was king for a day, I mean, I would hope that we could recruit people from our communities to serve our people in that way. I would hope that we could, involve more mental health professionals in addressing the issues that are currently, our police officers are called to respond to. One of the things that I've been advocating for ever since Initiative 940 has been the experiential type of training of our officers in the communities that they're going to serve in before they ever get there. Let's get them out into those communities while they're in the training academy. Help them get to know, bring in community members from the different cultures and groups that are in the areas that these officers are going to. Get them to know the community members before we ever send them out with a gun and a badge. That's what I would love to see, someday, so that the people that are policing us are the people who know us.
Thank you for that. Mr. Benengas, do you have a follow-up?
Kinda. I'll make it really quick. Ms. Holcomb, we've had discussed in the past the issue of qualified immunity. How much of an issue have you seen that being in Washington State? I mean, it sounds like it's not really written in an RCW, but it's just a precedent that may not even allow officers to be brought to court. Have you seen that as an issue?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. The caveat that I'll offer up right now is that really the experts that you would want to pose that question to would be attorneys who are actively representing individuals in civil rights lawsuits against police officers and departments and government agencies, and that are bringing those cases pursuant to federal law and for violations of their constitutional rights. So stretching way back to when I was a lawyer who did some civil rights litigation on my own, qualified immunity is certainly a significant issue whenever you're bringing claims in federal court, because it is a federal construct that can raise barriers to recovery. The law here in the state of Washington has very recently moved in a positive direction that may reduce some of the barriers to individuals recovering from government actors for violations of their constitutional rights. And I'm thinking specifically of tort claims that are brought under common law principles of negligence. So just in January of this year, our Washington State Supreme Court recognized in the case of Mancini versus City of Tacoma that officers do in fact owe a reasonable duty of care to individuals under common law tort concepts, not constitutional principles, under common law tort concepts. And in that case, again, this is a Black member of our community, a woman who was pulled out of her home in her pajamas, in her bedclothes, in a cold winter night, forced to stand outside for several minutes while officers executed a search warrant in her home and were at the wrong address. And fortunately, she succeeded in her case ultimately when it made it to the state Supreme Court, but that took 10 years for that recovery to happen. So I offer that up to say, yes, I do think qualified immunity is a significant issue. I do think that we have options at the state level for circumventing those problems. But ultimately, the concept of qualified immunity, which is that, no police officer can be held responsible for misconduct if there was not already a clearly established case, almost directly on point with similar facts, they can't be held accountable under there's a qualified immunity principle. And so you see how that just becomes a circular argument where I can't hold you accountable this time because it wasn't already established, and the serpent keeps eating its own tail until no one can be held accountable for misconduct.
Thank you for that. Mr. Reynoldston, do you have a question for our panelists?
Yes, let me just unmute that. Okay, so first off, thank you everyone on our panel. I thought it was another excellent panel today. And Mr. Raynon, I especially appreciated your heartfelt and passionate testimony today. And I hear you and hope that, we are able to do something to help continue moving the conversation forward and the needle forward on reducing unnecessary use of police use of force. As an attorney, I do feel the need to play devil's advocate today. And so I do have one question for Mr. Brown. So I would imagine that you would agree that the assertion, and setting aside whether or not it's accurate, that policing originally, at least in the United States, evolved out of directly helping to either support or enforce slavery is a controversial assertion. And so how would you respond to counter arguments that some may make that police forces prior to the existence of the United States existed that didn't have anything to do with directly enforcing or supporting slavery, such as cohorts urbanae in ancient Rome, or another example being the size of arms in Henry II's England, or constables and justices of the peace in the 1600s in England?
Yeah, I would say that we have to look at the purpose of those institutions in those countries. The creation and formation of law enforcement, policing in this country had a particular purpose in mind and had a particular community in mind as well. And so, I venture to stay particular to the United States because of how it has manifested and created the context we're living in today. And had our had the elites who were in power at that time taken those into consideration when they formed these patrols and law enforcement, we probably would have had a different outcome. But in that time period, protecting property, we're calling humans property, was the purpose of the formation of the police department in those times here in this country. And so that alone was a problem. So we started off on the wrong foot. So, yeah.
Mr. Reynoldston, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I think that covers it.
Great, thank you. Professor Ambrose.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone, and I apologize that I came in late. I was teaching this afternoon, so I wasn't able to be here until later, and I think I came in a little bit late during Ms. Holcomb's presentation, so I apologize if I'm going to ask something that you maybe already covered. But when I came in, you were talking a little bit about the importance of not allowing bargaining agreements, which permitted police to bargain away other people's constitutional rights or something like that, that we can't be bargaining over discipline. And so I was going to ask you whether any other states or other jurisdictions have been successful in coming up with rules or statutes that would prohibit that.
Thank you so much for that question. And no, I did not answer that question in my remarks. And I apologize. I should have updated my review of what other jurisdictions have done before joining you today. Washington, D.C. Passed an emergency ordinance last year, I'm forgetting the month, that as a blanket proposition removed collective bargaining, removed police discipline from collective bargaining. And because it was passed as an emergency ordinance, it didn't go into effect right away. Washington, D.C., of course, has a very specific way that ordinances can be introduced and passed. And I don't know what has occurred since then. So it's entirely possible that that's been completely modified or repealed. Colorado, if I'm remembering correctly, included some provisions around particular bargaining items in their omnibus reform package. And I believe Massachusetts did as well. And again, I apologize for not having more specific information to share. And thank you for the prompt that I need to go update my research.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. It wasn't supposed to be a test. It was just in case you had some good ideas for us. Or do either of the other panelists know of any other states that are maybe doing it right, or other jurisdictions that might be getting these issues or handling these issues in a different way?
I remember hearing an example of how one city, and I don't know if it's in Maryland, where they basically just fired the whole police department. And, and then they turned law enforcement over to the county as they reformed the the city law enforcement agency. And by doing that, the contract went away. They had to form a new contract that had those provisions that restricted chiefs and leadership to actually hold law enforcement officers accountable for their actions. It seemed a bit extreme, but I'm for it. You know, if it works, if it get the barrier out of the way, then let's do it. And I applaud them for whatever the extremes were to really respond to the communities that they serve. So.
Thanks for that. Ms. Snyder, do you have a question for our panelists? I'm sorry, Professor Snyder.
That's all right. I do not. I just want to thank all three of you for being here. Your testimony has been really, really thought-provoking and heartfelt, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us.
And then thank you. And then we have Ms. Enigen. Do you have a question for our panelists?
I just had an. Oops, I did. It's for Mr. Brown. I guess, Mr. Brown, do you think it's possible to identify candidates for the police who have a racial bias that you can, I guess, educate them out of?
That's a very good question. I think my approach to it, which I have lots of ideas on how to actually recruit candidates for law enforcement for the change that we want to experience. It starts with the interview process. I mean, candidates coming into law enforcement, why they made that choice of profession, and really kind of listen to what people say, because I have met some new police officers randomly who had very clear understandings of what their intentions were being on the force. That I think had they said that while they were going through the academy, they probably would not have passed. So I think that it goes to really looking at that process, that interview process, that whole cadet, process, what information and conversations are being had, and being very intentional about, how our community has experienced policing and how they're going to do something different. And if they say it in the academy, we have an opportunity before they hit the street and actually cause harm to our Black and Brown and Indigenous communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then Brian, do you have a question, Mr. Screener?
I do. Thank you for everyone joining us today and offering your expertise and life experiences. My question has to do with training, and I wonder if the amount of resources that we put towards police training, physical training, a fraction of that could go into community engagement and education. If that would be an avenue that helps people see individuals that don't look like them or don't have their lived experiences as people, and also allows individuals from communities that are horrifically impacted by police violence to join the police force to help change the way that forces look. And I ask this question all the time. The police is protecting whom? In many communities, the police are not there to protect. They're there to protect people like me who often don't live in those communities. And so, Mr. Brown, you brought up Detroit. And I'm wondering how we can have that conversation where police officers are trained, understand lived experience, and also are community advocates for communities that they patrol. And I'll ask Mr. Brown, Mr. Raynon, and specifically because I think they understand this community aspect from a personal level. And Ms. Holcomb, if there's anything that can be done on a policy level in regards to training, I'd be curious to hear. So, thank you.
I would say I wouldn't want to take money away from training. I think training needs to be very intentional and should be resourced appropriately. I would take money from other areas of the police department to improve relationships between all of our community and the law enforcement agencies, because I want our police officers to be fully trained, and I don't want to skip anything about that. We have some other practices in law enforcement, the militarized tools and toys, and the funds that go towards that could be easily diverted to improving engagement with communities of color. I would venture to guess that many of us, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, want to have better relationships and have better outcomes from our law enforcement agencies. It really starts with our agencies seeing us as fully human. We have very simple experiences of eye rolls and things that happen when we walk into police departments, when we walk into City Hall. There is these responses and behaviors that need to be addressed at the most simplest form. Basic customer service, that, can be trained out, but really having some really honest conversations about how we approach each other in this service of law enforcement that's being delivered. I think we could do it, and it's going to take time. You can't shortcut time that it's going to take to change. Short of completely doing what one agency did, is that fire everybody and start over. I think that if we really are honest about what's happening, people can fully share and not be shamed into silence as one practice in law enforcement. And this, weird compliance to the blue code, and we really talk, honestly about what's happening and what's expected, we can see the changes that we want to see.
Thanks, Mr. Raynon.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Brown. I would not want to see any of our training funding diverted, and there are other areas that we can reallocate funding to address community engagement, to rebalance the types of training. I mean, that was one of the focuses of Initiative 940, was to require more de-escalation training and first aid training and mental health training, so that our officers had more tools to utilize when responding to calls. And so I definitely wouldn't remove any of the current funding. In fact, I would ask for more funding for training so that we can truly give our officers the tools that they need. I would also, and I've been saying this to whoever would listen, that we need to spend more time in those less lethal alternative training than we do in the weapons and the combat training. I can't remember the exact proportion of training, but it's like there's 3/4 of the training in the academy is on physical training, on combat training, on arms training, and the rest is used for de-escalation, mental health, and those types of training. And so I think, if we can get more of the de-escalation and mental health training and the less lethal force training, I think that will go a long way in helping reduce deadly interactions with police. So
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to use chair's prerogative and ask my own question, and then I know Eric has indicated that you have another question as well. I'm wondering if the panelists have heard about the reforms being done in Brooklyn Center City, where Dante Wright was killed in early April, a young African-American man under a pretext traffic stop. He was killed. And the mayor's office introduced an ordinance that would do two things. One, create a new traffic enforcement bureau with civilians without guns in their hips to provide citations for traffic violations. And then another component, it was named after Dante Wright, and another young man who was killed, whose parents had actually called the police for assistance with a young man who had mental health issues. And so it's creating a public health and safety department with a crisis hotline and response team. So I'm wondering if the panelists have heard of these new types of transforming what some police will be doing, or what some cities will be doing, and if you think those are supportive and innovative ideas and might work. Allison, I know that the ACLU, the National ACLU, was very supportive in this endeavor, so I'll ask you first.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that this touches on what's alternately referred to in different quarters as reimagining policing, as depolicing, decriminalization. The idea at its heart is that we've really expanded the role and the duties that we assign to police officers who are armed with deadly weapons and are trained to treat every incident with community members as a potential life or death situation. And we are now having to spend so much time trying to retrain and make de-escalation tactics meaningful. And the question has to be asked, why are we relying on police services to accomplish so many tasks that are more appropriately matters of mental health, of substance use disorder, of lack of housing, of simple street disorder, but certainly don't require the level of enforcement power and weapons technology that we ascribe to situations that truly pose danger to individuals, including police officers themselves. So yes, we're very supportive of this and really thinking about what are the other components, what other community members can better serve the needs that our communities have.
Thank you. Mr. Raynon or Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I haven't really looked into the situation that you referenced, but having more community members involved in that, in policing, I think is a good thing. Like, Allison was mentioning that I think there is a need to shift some of the responsibilities that our police officers are currently using or responding to, and get those over to the professionals who are trained and educated and experienced in handling, mental health crises, for example, having more mental health professionals on call and ready and available for law enforcement to call. There's some things going on in Pierce County to that effect. I'm still learning about them. They've got mental health responders that go out with police officers. The jury's still out on whether that's the right way to go, but it is another example of teaming up professionals, mental health professionals, with law enforcement officers to respond to mental health crises. So yeah, I think we need to continue to explore those types of innovative ways to shift some of those responsibilities from law enforcement and put it in the hands of the professionals that have the skills to handle them.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I've been in a lot of conversations about reimagining policing, and definitely heard about what was happening and what's the name of the city?
Brooklyn Center City.
Brooklyn Center, yes. And I like where they're going. I think it's going to require us to be a bit more creative. I really like the idea of mental health professionals with law enforcement officers, with a caveat that the mental health professional is the lead and gives some direction to the law enforcement officer, as opposed to the law enforcement officer making the determination of how to lead that situation. As well as, I think about King County having a crisis and commitment services center that has mental health people who go out and are dispatched in a number of ways. And I've been toying with the idea of reimagining that service and implementing those with law enforcement agencies. I think that we don't have to go far to reimagine what this looks like. I think that there are examples around us that could be tweaked to really achieve what we're trying to accomplish. And we need to have the right people at the table. I don't think we have all of the right people at the table and what we're trying to reimagine. So, but I think that they're on the right, they're doing something different, and I'm all for it. I'm not signing up to give out traffic tickets, but I've noticed there are people in the community willing to do that. And good for them, because again, I'm gonna go back to history. The original police forces were volunteers often. Community members who stood watch in the night, they were watchmen, so just thinking about that history and thinking about it was volunteers who originally did this body of work. How can we reimagine some of that and bring our community into the role of holding that responsibility?
Great, thank you for that. Eric, or Professor Schnapper, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Brown talked about being afraid of law enforcement here, as he had not been in Michigan. And I noted that on Monday, Professor Vaughn talked about, who, as we're saying here, looked like Mr. Brown, but not entirely. It was Leah Vaughn. Talked about having to have the talk with her son. I wonder if the panelists could speak to the extent to which there is fear of law enforcement officers in the Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, and if there is fear, why that fear exists.
Tim, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, you know, I appreciate that question because it is a reality for many Indigenous people. I had to I've had that talk with my boys. I have 3 young boys, ages 12, almost 13 to 24, that are in that I know are in that category of people that are most likely to be killed by law enforcement. As I shared, we've experienced police violence in our own community, not just Jackie, but there have been others in our community that have been beaten and bloodied. I personally have experienced being profiled and followed in my vehicle because I had a feather hanging down and a Native American Rights Fund sticker on the side of my car, seeing an officer turn around and follow me for, a couple miles. And I've witnessed my own son being pulled over by a police officer, being asked to step out of the vehicle and go into a police officer's car, put your hands behind your back and being handcuffed. I witnessed that. And the fear that I've experienced is real. Now, luckily, we had the talk before that had happened, and he cooperated, and he made it out of that experience alive. But not all of our people come home alive. That is a very real thing that we have experienced in our community. And like I said, my experience pales in comparison to those families whose loved one didn't come home after that. And so that's why we have those talks with our children. And my hope is that with the reforms that we're doing, the work that we're doing, that one day my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren won't have to experience that fear. That's what we're doing this work for. And so I thank you for asking the question, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share these thoughts and these feelings with you, because they're really close to our heart.
Thank you for being so forthcoming, Mr. Raymond. Mr. Brown, do you want to share your perspective?
Yeah, the fear is very real. We see evidence of that almost daily these days, thanks to camera phones and that. Having to have that conversation, absolutely. In my experience, having to have that conversation from my family who are they're still active police officers, because they wanted us to be prepared when we, have interactions. When police officers started entering our school systems and being called on by our teachers, we had to know a protocol for our survival. Driving while Black, I've experienced that so much I could write a book, probably 2 books on it. But I think that I am here today because of the talk. I survived those. It's unfortunate that it is required protocol for Black and brown parents to have those conversations with our kids until the system change. I am waiting. I don't think I'll ever see it in my lifetime when it changes, but I'm working on it. I'm working on the change.
Thank you for your response. And I'll just add, as chair of this committee, to put it on record, Eric, I've had the conversation with my Black children as well, with my Black husband as well. we have a strategy, a game plan that if we're pulled over, I will unbuckle his seatbelt for him, right? His registration is above his visor, so he doesn't have to reach. So this isn't, so many of us, I don't want to speak for all people of color, but so many of us, and it's not just about events and moments of being pulled over, but it's about the emotional suiting up, if you will, that we have to have these conversations and that we're constantly thinking about this when we see police in our communities. So I really, we have one more question, but I just really want to emphasize, I so appreciate everyone being so forthcoming and sharing your emotions and your personal perspectives and reminding this committee that what we are doing isn't just about laws and policies, but it's about real world experiences and trauma that our communities are experiencing every day. So I know that, do any of our committee members have another question? I know Kelly would like to ask a question. Oh, we have a couple more. Okay, so let's do Andrew and then Tony.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up for Mr. Brown. I think this is a follow-up to Eric's question. You contrasted Michigan with Washington State. Can you like dig as deep as you can to say, what is it about Washington State that creates the environment of fear? Is it just the color of the people who are police officers? What is it? Do you have any sense or hunch about that?
I feel like I'm in the Wild Wild West, and it's shoot first, ask questions later. And that is not what I experienced in Michigan. And I think that is at the core. That's the conversation. Why is the response to my Black body to go for your weapon? And to have actually witnessed very similar situations where that is not the approach to white bodies. So there is something there. I don't know whether it is, you know, officers having some socialized fear that manifests in these approaches. I don't know. I can't put my finger on it, but the way in which I have experienced being approached, and it's not. I live in Seattle, but I travel, and the times that I have been stopped, I felt that they were more fearful of me, and I don't have a gun. Well, that's another conversation. But at the time, I didn't have a gun, and but to if I can feel that, you know, that they had that type of tension and that feeling, that emotion that was going on, I don't know what to do with that, and there's nothing in the moment that I can do about it. There's nothing that I can do to make that officer more comfortable with my Black body. And so something in there's a conversation that needs to be had. There's some deeper conversations, some very honest conversations need to be had about that. Because, you know, I have been stopped by many a white police officer, state troopers in Michigan, and I've never feared for my life. I have never been beaten up by a police officer. And I've been pulled over a many a time. And that you know, that is, you know, without question. But I've never had that experience. And something about that is a regular experience for people here in the state of Washington when it comes to Black and brown people. There's something there.
Thank you for that. Mr. Benengus, you have a question?
Yeah, this is for Mr. Rainen. Again, thank you for your words. Really appreciate the wisdom, and all the panelists. Your words are just incredible. Thank you so much. But Mr. Rainen, it sounded like you mentioned an online database about Native Americans. I was kind of wondering if you can maybe share that database, and you know, how'd you make it, and what kind of conclusions could you share with us, or maybe in writing after the meeting's over.
Yeah. No, it's not a database that's specifically for Native Americans. It's a database, an online database that tracks police use of force cases throughout the country. And they have it so you can, search different types of interactions, different racial interaction, those types of things. And so what I did was I put in Native American police use of force, and it pulled up 131 deaths since January 1st of 2016. And I use that date because that was when Jacqueline Sawyer's, our tribal member, was killed. And that's when I got involved in the work. So I'm not aware of a truly, that's the first database that I've seen that has, a good representation of police use of force cases. But we know that, at least for our community, we know that it's likely underreported because, a lot of times people don't identify us as Native Americans. They identify as some other race oftentimes. So even with that, I'm fairly confident that number is underreported. So I wish I had a more definitive and real numbers for you, or a database that we could provide. But that's one of the things that's lacking, is data collection. And so hopefully with some of the legislation that's been passed, we can start collecting data on police use of force and really, hone in on what's causing it and what we can do to stop it.
Thank you for that. And I put in the chat, it's fatalencounters.org is the website for national data. And that's the data that Professor Edwards used. Kelly has a question. We have 15 more minutes, just so everyone is careful with their response time. But Kelly, it's yours.
Yeah, I just want to start off by thanking the panelists and our chair, Alexis Harris, for being so honest about their experiences. I think lived experiences are really central when talking about policing in this country. I would just like to ask any panelist who's interested, what methods or steps would you suggest for police agencies or unions who are trying to bridge this gap between themselves and communities? Like, how can they build this trust moving forward?
Reach out to us, sit down with us, share a meal with us. One of the things we did with Initiative 940 that I'm really proud of is once we got the signatures and qualified the initiative for the ballot, we sat down with law enforcement to try and work out a bill that would strengthen and clarify Initiative 940. And that's what we did. We sat down with representatives from the different police unions and police organizations, and we started to build those relationships. And as we continued through this legislative session, we continued to meet with many of them and to try and come to some consensus on the policies that would best serve our communities. But really, to bridge to build those bridges, they need to reach out to our communities, our community leaders and our residents, and be more welcoming.
I would echo that it's definitely in relationship. You got to come out of your precincts, and you got to stop your patrol cars and actually engage. There's some fears that need to be addressed that need to happen on people's own time, but in that relationship building, that's the key. And for me, Black folks, most Black folks I know, it's all about relationship. That's the key.
And that's what I would add as well is get out of the cars, get off your bicycles, take off your sunglasses, change the color of your uniforms, stop wearing weapons, and walk the beat.
Thank you for that. And we don't have any public comment, so I'll move to adjourn. I do have a few things to say, but I really do want to thank our panelists for spending their time, but spending their emotion. That I know talking about these issues, it's hard and emotional. So Mr. Raynon, thank you for reminding us why we're here and why it's so important and the trauma that excessive use of force causes to our communities. Mr. Brown, thank you for bringing in the history, reminding us of where we've been, and also naming anti-racism, right, and anti-Blackness. And Dr. I promoted you, Allison. Sorry, this whole time I'm trying to be formal. Thank you for bringing this important legal insight into really the nuance issues related to policy changes and the needs. So we really, really appreciate your time. So I'm going to read what I have to read now. The transcript and other materials will be available within 30 days following this meeting. If you provided your email address when you joined, we will send you follow-up information regarding how to access those materials. We will also notify you when the committee is meeting for follow-up discussion and when the report will be available. All of that will be public. The record will remain open through June 18th, 2021. If anyone would like to submit written comment, please send this by email to Brooke Peery at bperry@usccr.gov. So with that, thank you all. Please have a great, healthy, safe evening. I did want to, there were some books put in the chat. So I referenced one, The Condemnation of Blackness, which is a great history on policing and in the US. And then someone, I think it was Brian, mentioned Isabel Wilkerson's The Origins of Our Discontents. So these are great books on history and policing and race. With that, as a professor, I had to do that, sorry. Okay, have a great night. Thank you, everyone. For the committee, we'll see you on Monday. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.